Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I take you through my top 5 favorite albums from every year. In our last episode, we covered the year 1965, which was a pivotal year in 60s music, with folk rock being at its peak in popularity, and pop music is starting to evolve more by incorporating more rich orchestrations and instrumentations, and we hear some elements of psychedelic also starting to creep in on certain albums. And it's very clear that there is a lot of exciting things on the horizon for the middle and later part of the 60s. And we saw the emergence of a lot of amazing artists, bands, and records, and it culminated into an even further creative breakthrough that we saw play out in the year 1966, which is one of my personal favorite years of 60s music. I think there was a lot of incredible stuff to come out of this year. So that's the year we're going to be covering today. And please let me know what your 5 favorite albums are from this year in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums from 1966, starting with number 5. Alright, coming in at number 5, we have Renaissance by The Association. The Association is a really amazing band to come out of the 60s, and they seem to be pretty overlooked by a lot of music listeners. A lot of people might know a couple of their hit songs if they hear them, but they don't necessarily know who the band The Association was and what their contributions were to 60s music. And when it comes to 60s pop, I think this album is a very strong contribution to the year 1966. It's got 12 tracks, and stylistically it features this great blend of 60s rock, folk rock, and psychedelic pop. And the musicianship of this group in particular, I think, is very strong for a 60s band. They write some really interesting, colorful, and unique stuff, and I think nothing about the music that they produce could be considered cliche by any stretch. You've got really great vocal harmonies, colorful chord movements, pretty melodies, and a couple of the members of this group are doing some great jobs doubling on a couple of other instruments as well. My personal favorite track on here would be Memories of You, which has an absolutely beautiful and powerful sounding chorus with these really hard-hitting vocal harmonies. And my other favorites would be No Fair at All, Pandora's Golden Heebie-Jeebies, and Looking Glass. And this was their second album, and from a songwriting perspective, I think it was an even further improvement upon everything that they did on their first release, and set up a really great framework for them to continue to deliver a couple more really incredible albums in the later part of the 60s. And I think this album does a great job of serving up a little bit of everything great that there was to offer in 66, between the folk rock elements, the pop elements, as well as the psychedelic sounds that started to creep in more and more on certain albums. So I think this is a very good album to come out of 1966, and if you are a fan of 60s pop, I would highly recommend checking this out. I think this is one of the better albums to come out of the Association discography. So that is my number 5. Now on to number 4. Okay, for number 4, I've got an album by Dionne Warwick titled Here Where There Is Love, another amazing album to come out of her 60s catalog. And as I've mentioned in a previous video, probably my favorite songwriter of all time is Burt Bacharach, and he wrote a lot of the big hits that Dionne Warwick had in the 60s and the early part of the 70s. And this is another album that has some really exceptional Burt Bacharach compositions. The album is 10 songs long, with the first 6 tracks being written by Burt Bacharach, and then the final 4 are a variety of different covers. And it's got 4 songs that are regarded as Burt Bacharach classics, with What the World Needs Now Is Love, I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself, Trains and Boats and Planes, and Alfie, which is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful ballads ever written, and Dionne Warwick's version of it is by far my favorite. Of the 6 Bacharach songs on here, if I had to pick a favorite one, it would actually be the title track, Here Where There Is Love. That song has some really interesting chord movements, opening up with a major 7 sharp 5 chord, which is one of the only songs that I've ever been able to find that opens with such a tense and dissonant chord, and the way that they resolve it is just so beautiful, and it contains all of the magic of Burt Bacharach in one track, and I would consider this to be one of the most underrated Burt Bacharach songs ever. Definitely check it out if you're a fan of really adventurous harmonic movements. In addition to that, my other 2 favorites would have to be Alfie and What the World Needs Now Is Love. both absolutely beautiful songs that are just timeless. And for the remaining 4 covers, we have 2 ballads, with one titled As Long As He Needs Me and a version of the jazz standard I Wish You Love, both very beautiful interpretations of those songs, and great orchestrations that do a great job of complementing Dionne Warwick's beautiful voice in a very nice manner. And we also have a cover of a nice groovy track titled I Never Knew What You Were Up To. And then the album concludes with a nice upbeat interpretation of Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind. And of my 5 albums for 1966, I am willing to bet that this is probably the one that the most people have not heard before, so I would definitely recommend checking it out. Like I said, Burt Bacharach's compositions are about as good as they get, in my opinion, and Dionne Warwick's interpretations of them are always my favorite. She's probably my favorite female singer of the 60s. I always think that her song choices are so tasteful, and the way that she interprets every song is just so beautiful, and she's got an incredible voice. So that's my number 4 album of 1966. Now on to number 3. Alright, for number 3, I've got Revolver by the Beatles, a Beatles classic, and I'm sure not very many people are surprised to see this one pop up on my list. An amazing follow-up to Rubber Soul that saw an even further expansion of the Beatles' sound, and the final album that the Beatles would put out before they would retire from doing live performances, and none of the songs on this album were ever performed live, which was definitely a pivotal shift in the sound of the Beatles, now that they were solely focused on making albums in the studio rather than being concerned with writing songs that they had to perform in a live setting. And this one veers into even more psychedelic territories with a wider use of instrumentations and more experimentation with recording techniques, and really expanding the capabilities of what they were able to achieve in the studio. It spawned a bunch of Beatles classics like Taxman, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, Yellow Submarine, and Good Day Sunshine. And it also has some really incredible B-sides that I think in certain instances are even better than some of the hits to come off of this record, with tracks like I'm Only Sleeping, And Your Bird Can Sing, and For No One. Lyrically, the subject matter on a lot of these songs is much deeper than the stuff that they had commented on previous albums as well, which was largely due to the counterculture that was happening in 1966 and their experimentation with LSD. I think the songwriting from John, Paul, and George is top-notch all throughout this record, and I really appreciate the fact that George Harrison gets 3 songs on this album. I always appreciate a George Harrison contribution, and the fact that there are 3 songs on this album I think also enhances the record greatly. And I love whenever he writes a song that goes into that raga rock territory, because that is a style that is uniquely George and does a really great job of contrasting the compositional sensibilities of John and Paul in a very unique way. Another huge thing in favor of this album for me is it contains my number 1 favorite Paul McCartney's Beatles song, which is Here, There, and Everywhere. I think that song is absolutely beautiful and is probably my number 1 favorite song on this record. Other favorites of mine on here would be And Your Bird Can Sing, Eleanor Rigby, For No One, and Tomorrow Never Knows. And the only critique that I would give this album is that I'm not a huge fan of the song Yellow Submarine, and that seems to be a pretty divisive song amongst the Beatles community. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's just one of those tracks that's never done anything for me, and I think if they just took it off of the album, it would have enhanced it even more. And like I mentioned on the previous episode, we all have albums where it's almost perfect from front to back, but then there's that one song that you don't like that puts a little dip in momentum on the record. And for me, this is definitely an album that is another example of that, but all of the other tracks on here are so exceptional that to me, it really doesn't make a huge difference. I would have preferred if Yellow Submarine was left out, but the remainder of the album is just so strong with so many exceptional and standout tracks, and definitely a handful of my favorite Beatles songs of their entire discography. So that definitely carries the album and doesn't, make a huge difference because of that one track that I'm not crazy about. And the influence and evolution of the Beatles sound on this record cannot be overstated, and I'm always sort of torn as to what my favorite Beatles album is. I kind of have two that I veer between depending on what mood I'm in, but this is definitely one of the contenders for my top two favorite Beatles albums. And if you are interested in hearing a more in-depth review of the Beatles discography and how I rank all of their albums, you can check out my tier list playlist, which is linked in the description. But yeah, an amazing album that was a pivotal record in the Beatles discography, where they really deliver a more significant batch of the psychedelic tracks that we started to hear a little bit on Rubber Soul, and also the first album where they had transitioned over to being a studio band, where we heard a completely new side of the Beatles, where they didn't have to worry about performing live and instead could really focus on delivering some sounds that were just incredible for the later part of the 60s. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 is Speak No Evil by Wayne Shorter. For anybody who is not aware of who Wayne Shorter is, he's a legendary jazz saxophonist, mostly known for his jazz stuff, but he also contributed on a variety of different records for artists like Joni Mitchell, Steely Dan, Jaco Pastorius, and Norah Jones, among many others. And unfortunately, he passed away in March of 2023, which was a massive loss for the jazz community, probably one of the biggest losses in a really long time. But I think that this album was the best recording of his lifetime from a compositional standpoint and also from a group standpoint, with the absolutely superb lineup of Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums, two of which are still alive to this day and are living legends with Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter. And stylistically, these songs are a mixture of post-bop, modal jazz, and hard bop, which are jazz songs that encompass more non-traditional forms of harmony, meaning that a lot of the chord movements and chord qualities being used on this are more unorthodox and modern and aren't derivative of the traditional major and minor scales that we hear in a lot of Western music. And this style of jazz was becoming more prevalent in the late 50s and the 60s, as a lot of jazz artists were trying to expand their sound more and break free from a lot of the traditional jazz vocab that we had heard up to this point. And I think that this album is one of the best pieces of work to come out of that time period of jazz. The record has 6 songs, all written by Wayne Shorter, and I think Wayne Shorter's compositions all throughout the 60s were really amazing, but I think this album in particular contains some of the best songs that he's ever written, and it spawned a couple of songs that are now regarded as Wayne Shorter classics, with tracks like Witch Hunt, Fee Fi Fo Fum, and the title track Speak No Evil. The melodies and harmonic movements on these songs are top-notch, and it creates a really beautiful canvas for the powerhouse rhythm section of Herbie, Ron Carter, and Elvin Jones to really just go off and create so much magic throughout this record. And the horn pairing of Wayne Shorter and Freddie Hubbard is amazing. Both of their styles of playing complement each other very nicely, and they both take some really incredible solos throughout this album. For me personally, though, the person that I think really steals the show on this record is Herbie Hancock. Every single solo he takes on this is just absolutely mind-blowing. If you want to hear some really just insane piano solos, I would just listen to this record and check out every solo that Herbie takes, because they go into so many wild territories that are just like unheard of, even by today's standards. Herbie was so ahead of his time and is one of the greatest jazz piano players of all time, and this album, I think, is one of the best examples of how incredible of a piano player he really is. My personal favorite solos of his on here are Witch Hunt and Speak No Evil, but he solos on 5 of the 6 songs on here, and listening to each of them is just an amazing experience that takes you through so many different feels and emotions. And I also love the placement of track 5, which is titled Infant Eyes. It's a ballad that I think is placed very effectively, because this album hits us with so much intensity, and having that one ballad placed on the 5th track to set up the final song, I think, was a very effective choice and does a really great job of providing us with a little breather from all of the intensity that we've been hit with up to this point. But yeah, I cannot say enough good things about this album. If you're a fan of jazz and you haven't heard this one before, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Like I said, it's not going to sound like a traditional jazz record. It's a little bit more modern, but I still think it's got all of the factors in place to appeal to a regular music listener. It's got great melodies, and the rhythm section is just so good, and the communication between them is so strong that I think it can appeal to a normal music listener who's not as familiar with this style of jazz. So that's my number 2 album of 1966. Now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1966. Okay, coming in at number 1, we've got Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Of all of the years that I'm going to be covering in this series, this is probably my most predictable choice, especially for anybody who has been a fan of my channel for some time. It's a well-known fact that the Beach Boys are one of my favorite bands, and this is regarded as the best Beach Boys album of all time, and I would definitely agree with that sentiment. As cliche of a choice as it is, I think it's for good reason why so many people hold this album in such high regard. This album was just an absolute creative explosion on Brian Wilson's part, and on a couple of the albums that preceded it, we heard his songwriting start to venture into more artsy and experimental territories, and to me that was all a precursor to this album where Brian Wilson reaches his creative peak. Stylistically, this one ventures into more art rock, baroque pop, and progressive pop territories, and has very little stylistic remains of that surf rock sound that we got on the earlier part of the Beach Boys discography. Brian Wilson also did production on this, with very clear influences from Phil Spector with that classic wall of sound production style. And I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I have heard some people say that they think that the inspiration for the title Pet Sounds was because it shared the same initials as Phil Spector with PS. Like I said, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I have heard some people say that, and I thought it was an interesting, fun little fact. Musically, I think this is some of the most complex, daring, and adventurous music to come out of 60s pop. Brian's sense of harmony is continuing to expand with all sorts of unusual chord progressions and harmonic movements and key changes, and his further expansion of slash chords, which is something that Brian Wilson was known for putting on the map when it came to pop music, and is something that was responsible for really expanding the harmonic language that we utilize in pop songs. The instrumentation and orchestration throughout this record is absolutely mind-blowing, with the Wrecking Crew on Personnel creating these massive sheets of sound that add so much more depth to these already amazing and beautiful compositions. And when it comes to the individual songs, I think every song from front to back on this album is amazing. It's one of the few albums where I would say there is not a bad track and not a wasted minute anywhere throughout any of these songs. And if I was doing a top 10 list of favorite Beach Boys songs, this album contains my number 1 and number 2 pick, which are the songs I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and God Only Knows. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times is such a sad song, writing about how Brian feels disconnected from the world that he was living in at that time, and it features some of my favorite vocal harmonies of any Beach Boys song. And you can just look up this album and listen to some of the a cappella versions of these songs, and you would be amazed at how much stuff is going on just within the vocals, never mind the instruments. And that's another thing that I particularly love about this album, is the very intricate vocal writing, and this song in particular I think has some incredibly strong vocal work. And God Only Knows is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful love songs ever written, and that vocal round at the end of the song is, in my opinion, one of the most perfect sections to ever come out of any pop song. In addition to those 2 tracks, a couple of other favorites of mine would be Wouldn't It Be Nice, Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, I'm Waiting for the Day, and Caroline No. And this album is just incredible. It left such a legacy on 60s pop music and will forever be regarded as Brian Wilson's greatest achievement of his lifetime. And I've studied every song on this album pretty extensively, so if you are interested, please check out my Beach Boys guitar arrangements, which will be linked in the comments. I've done guitar arrangements of every song on the Pet Sounds album, in addition to a bunch of other Beach Boys songs that I love. And I also did a video where I go more in depth ranking every album from the Beach Boys discography, so that will also be linked in the description in my tier lists playlist if you're interested in checking that out. So probably not a huge surprise to anybody, this is my number 1 favorite album of 1966, and I think it's pretty hard to argue otherwise. So to recap for today, My 5 favorite albums of 66, number 5, we have Renaissance by The Association. Number 4, we have Here Where There Is Love by Dionne Warwick. Number 3, we have Revolver by the Beatles. Number 2, we have Speak No Evil by Wayne Shorter. And number 1, we have Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and please let me know your top 5 favorite albums from this year. I would love to hear your thoughts. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 albums of 1967. I'll see you then. Take care.